Welcome, everybody. Blessed are those that visit this channel and enjoy the content here.
Right, this is going to be episode 20 of Esports Salon. If you actually saw episode 19, this is one of the only times this show will ever have an actual sequel / cliffhanger ending that leaves people wondering how many of the characters indeed will come back for the next season. Because actually, number 19 was the same panel of people, and we had not the same discussion, I would hope, but we'll have a similar one along similar vein, because at the end of the episode, if people remember, right as it was just starting to neatly tail off, as content creators would hope the show would, at the end, people sort of just threw their hat in the ring with an extra topic, which itself could have been an entire show, maybe this one. So one thing I won't be doing, unlike the last episode, is awkwardly trying to say exactly what all the fucked up titles these guys have all given themselves at their law firms, because as I learned a long time in esports, nobody just works for a company. They're all like the fucking founding, like I love it when they start making that distinction, like, so does he, it's like when it says like founder plus he's like some position now, it's like, does that even mean he's even at the company still? Like, I can't even always tell by the way they phrase. Like, I feel like when we think about who these people are, whenever they're being like even slightly vague like that, that's intentional. Like, they're managing our perceptions of what even their jobs are in the industry. But anyway, so obviously, you know, Richard, he was on the last one. This time, probably not going to make as scintillating a cameo in as much as he hasn't just come straight out of California legal principles.
No, I haven't. No, and I have just been streaming the major challenger stage.
When you could, you know.
Yeah.
When you could.
Yeah, well, yeah, I was going to say, enjoying it while it lasts.
Oh, right. So what you mean, Richard, is actually you've come with an entirely different understanding of law for this particular episode. And
they definitely have an entirely different understanding of law. I'll say that for fucking nothing. So, yeah.
They were like,
but no, I'm good at the moment.
Richard, we own everything. Everything. So, if you were to give us the access to directly ourselves run ads on your channel, then we would consider giving you this content of yours anyway.
Obviously, I won't derail the start of the show, but it is strange. They haven't got back to me. Like, we just made an agreement. Sure. I don't have to do any of those things. They just said you can do it, just don't hide the ads in GoTV.
You've actually just made...
For a rights holder, you're being mighty generous.
Sure.
You know, I don't know. Maybe that makes me think something not quite right with this picture. But
I will say this, Richard. Like, it's a line I have now that I always use with mods and stuff. Is when you're dealing with someone who is inherently unreasonable, anytime they ask you politely not to do something, they've actually just signaled that they had no power over you whatsoever. Because if they're entirely unreasonable, they'd just take whatever action they could. They'd ban you. They'd kick you out. They'd silence you. So actually, you've just made me realize we should definitely do another episode sometime, though, that is on the concept of things like IP rights, in terms of when you like let someone use the right but you don't give them it necessarily, because the two obvious examples would be CSGO and Dota, with this whole thing of like, well, you can stream the GoTV, but can you? And then existing in some mad quantum super state where you both can and cannot at the same time. And then the other one, I think that would make this a good episode, actually, I'll do this in another one, is the whole thing where Riot have the ProView tool, so you pay for that, you've got it, etc. And then they say, of course you can all use it. Sort of, because maybe if you're a content creator, maybe you can't use it. It's like, I've always wondered about that aspect. Obviously, this is slightly derailed, but like the angle where it's like, on the one hand, they're sort of like saying they're going to let you, but they haven't really given you necessarily like a legal provision there, as far as I can tell. So that would be an interesting topic, because I'm pretty sure actually a lot of industry people are interested in that, to know what the situation is, where the fuck does anyone even stand, and what would you do either way on that one. But anyway, this episode will rewind.
This episode won't be about any of that.
It won't, no.
That's a teaser for part 3.
Basically,
you have to ask about IP rights at the very end.
Yes, exactly. No, the way I operate is, it's the same principle I use. It's actually one of the reasons why in the modern day I don't go to see movies that I think are even at all whack. Because I'll tell you, the worst feeling I think ever in a cinema is when you go to see a movie that even you're thinking is going to be like, it's probably going to be like 6 out of 10. Like, it might be all right. And then they show a trailer for a really great movie and you go, why the fuck am I not watching that? Like, no, I've just seen an awesome trailer. Now I'm just going to watch my shitty movie. Like, great. Now I've ruined the experience for myself before it's even begun. So hopefully this hasn't ruined the experience of watching this episode. But if it has, whatever, it's free anyway. Fuck off. So I believe where you ended, right, was a very, very abstract point that Bryce made, where he basically said that in some sense, all contracts, in fact, the very foundation of contracts and business generally, is exploitative. Now, the key caveat I'll add to that is just a word in a dictionary. It doesn't necessarily mean what might be conjured into your mind when you hear the word exploitative, because the first thing you think of is probably some kid in Southeast Asia who's making some Nikes right now. Like, that sounds, it's really horrible. But the point actually that I think Bryce was making there is, like, all contracts are based around the idea that I am going to extract from you, hopefully more money than I am paying you, and therefore in some sense I'm exploiting you, because if you somehow could do that yourself, you could make all that money. And then there's the whole angle that goes from beyond that. So when you say that, Bryce, like, the abstract, when I unpack it a bit there, doesn't sound as sexy anymore. It doesn't sound as crazy as that initially did. Did you mean did you have more of a pointed angle to why all contracts like that in some sense? Because actually, obviously the thing was, Ryan himself then sort of like disagreed, but in a way where, again, it was cliffhanger. Like, he had no time to actually unpack it all. So make your case in this sense, Bryce.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what I said at the end, but I think how I feel about this is all contracts are two parties who are trying to get more out of the other side than they could get themselves independently,
sure.
Right? And there's a reason why, like, vertical integration in business works. Like, when you control the whole value pipeline, you can stop people from extracting their pound of flesh every single step of the way, right? So, like, if you're paying, if Amazon is paying some, middlemen suppliers to, like, do all of their shipping and, like, do all their boxing, etc., then those businesses have to make a margin on it in order to survive, right? So it's always going to be more expensive if you can actually do it in-house. The problem is not every person or every business can do everything they need, in-house. And so you enter into third-party commercial relationships where someone's doing something for you in exchange for you doing something for them. And at, a base capitalistic level, right, both sides should theoretically be extracting more out of the other side. So, like, in a standard player contract, for example, right, the theory is that the team is going to get more in exchange for their salary than they would get in return, right? And they
Sure.
recoup in a number of different ways, right? They directly monetize via sponsorships. There's indirect benefits in, sponsorships and other forms of revenue generation, right? There's, some ancillary benefits that are a little bit harder to quantify, like growth of the brand, right? Like Doublelift plays on Team Liquid for a few years and helps create more Team Liquid fans. So whenever he retires or goes to a different team, hopefully Team Liquid has had some brand building as a result of that, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile,
that part's obviously a bit tougher to gauge, but yeah, obviously it makes sense. I mean, I'll give you even an obvious example is, like, when they brought me and Richard onto Deserto, and I think they'd even admit this, they did it because the rep of their site is it's just clickbait. So their logic is get the people whose work isn't considered just clickbait.
Yeah.
Irony there, Rich. We got him in the end, tricked him in the end. Little did they know it was all clickbait. But anyway, yeah, the joke being this makes it more respectable again. Fucking suckers, got them all again. No, but no, for real. Yeah, it does though. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, you absolutely can have that halo effect. It happens all the time in influencer contexts, right? You hire one big influencer, you put them in a house with a bunch of smaller influencers. Lo and behold, the smaller influencers get bigger. You're not just paying the big.
That does sound like some sort of fucked up Skinner box fucking conclusion that you just made there. Like,
I mean, it works though. I mean, like, this is something that's been around as part of YouTube for a really long time, and there's so many different examples of this at this point. It's kind of starting to come to esports, but when you pay that big creator to be a part of whatever it is that you're doing, you're not just paying them for how you think you can directly monetize them, the content, et cetera. You're also, there's a halo effect for your brand, for the other people under your brand, et cetera. So I think that's the core point I was driving at.
Okay. So then what, like, aside from one, scoring points against Bryce, telling him he's wrong at all points, what was the central gist of why you disagree with that as a premise? Like, does it not have to be exploitative? Do you define exploitative differently, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I disagree with that base statement that both parties are trying to get something out of a contract. That's business. I mean, that's every basic contract throughout history. What I disagree with is Bryce's idea of, I think where he got to on the last episode is that this process will regulate itself by good business. Companies will be forced to do right by their bigger streamers so that the bigger streamers stay with them and creates that halo effect, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the esports industry has proven that's not true. This is an industry of bright-eyed, starry-eyed kids coming in that play games in their basements or their very nice houses, not basements, to fight the stereotype their entire lives to get an opportunity. And all of a sudden this org comes through, and sometimes it's a great tier 1 org like Liquid. Other times it's a tier 3 org that's going to just ruin their lives and careers. But those contracts and those original pitches sound the same to someone coming out of this amateur league. And the first contract most people sign in esports is the worst contract of their career. And we've seen it, my firm and my agency, many times. It's career ruining. It is a situation where they never get to a liquid or an energy. They're just stuck at the bottom forever. And what I'm arguing for is that, it's just saying, well, sure, some people get exploited. That's how this starts out. They want to grow, so they'll sign with an org. They give up all their rights in exchange. It doesn't have to be that way. I think this industry needs a lot more regulation of what is an org, what is a team, what is the actual bottom threshold of making it. There is no ancillary, there is no parallel to traditional sports for that, where I can just put on a hat with a logo I got off Fiverr.com, call myself an org, and say, now we're in the Contenders Open division. Let's go play some Overwatch. You can't do that in basketball. I would know very quickly that you're not a legitimate team. You have no legitimate resources, etc. And there are no protections in esports like that. We're just living in a situation where kids are constantly taken advantage of, and there is nothing preventing that in the amateur ranks.
So, I think I don't actually core disagree with anything. I think that what I would say is that the free market works these things out over time. So, right, like you're comparing a basketball ecosystem that's been around for, competitive basketball in the United States, right, just a little bit under 100 years if we're going back to like OG, before ABA, before NBA type of leagues, right, 75 years-ish. So, it didn't start at the end, right? It started at the beginning and there were problems and then you work themselves out along the way. It's the same thing when we talk about, you and I agree on a lot of the core concepts of like what needs to get solved for, right? Like, I don't think that contract that the brand new crappy organization puts in front of this kid who just has a dream and wants to start their esports career is good either, generally speaking. And I think we do need to solve for that. And I think more regulation is really important. I'm a big advocate, as are you, I believe, of self-regulation and starting to sort this stuff out on our own before, you have Congress regulating baseball, right? It's like, get out of my sports. Makes no sense, right?
But the difference there, and I want you to finish your point, but I figured, let's just touch on each thing individually. The difference there is we are basketball, baseball, every other sport throughout history, nothing grew as quickly and gained such an international fan base in the history of mankind as quickly as video games did. And we're seeing all of the stuff that sure might have worked itself out over 50 years has to now be figured out in a year or two. And it's not happening. There is no figuring it out. There's no players association. There's no union. There's no anything for most of these players when there was, even in the early days of sports, it is happening. Like, if you were to look at, and it's happening faster, right? As all these things do. So if you were to look at like the early history of professional baseball, for example, and what it looked like, right? The original form player contract was insanely oppressive, and it took them over a decade to get to the point where they were even materially negotiating that. Then they started to, there was this concept called the reserve clause that basically trapped a player with one team for their entire career. And it took them 10, 15, 20 years to even start having a conversation around that, to get organized, right? Before there was ever a union, then there existed in that state for a while. Then they found the union, right? So, we live in a world in which we often joke about like the dawning of the modern era of esports, right? I don't know exactly when that occurred, but we're going through it right now, right? That's the thing that's happening. And in the last, let's say the last like 5-ish years, esports has turned into really material, like meaningful business. In that span of time, we have like adopted an industry standard player contract that has had a lot of iteration from you and from some other representation that is heavy on the player side, right? And I'm not saying it's perfect. It will continue to improve along the way, though you cannot quote that against me in negotiations. And we have founded, not unions, but organized player representative bodies in the League of Legends ecosystem, in the Counter-Strike ecosystem. There's, rumblings of it obviously in the Overwatch ecosystem. We stood up. Think about how long it took to get to franchised leagues in these other sports, right? And we stood them up basically overnight in the last 3 years. So, there's a lot of growth and development that's happening very quickly. I do see, if you and I were to talk about like where we were 5 years ago versus where we are now, there's been insane development. I think you would agree with that. And that development is much faster than what happened in traditional sports because we're growing faster. And listen, I mean, there's no way to not say it pompously, but there is not a you and a me in Europe or Asia. And I think you see in these contracts that your template and my agency representing over 300 players over the past few years has really changed what the standard contract looks in North America. Mm-hmm. But man, I see European contracts come in from players now more and more as we're expanding out there. I see the Australian contracts with my team down there. I see the Asian contracts. They are still where we were 5 years ago, and they're playing the same games. So I hear you at the top, it's getting fixed and better. But even there, your argument against me always, which is a great argument, it actually is, I'm not belittling it, is, Ryan, your clients don't care. They want the salary and to walk away, and that's the contract. They signed it. They're happy. They don't care. They don't want to argue about likeness rights. They don't want to argue about sponsorship rights. And oftentimes I'm stuck in a really terrible position because that's not inaccurate. Most of my players do not care or understand the business or understand how much they could be making. And we do our best to educate them on that. But at the end of the day, most esports players want to play their game, get their check, go home and win. And it's not until the end of their careers when they start to say, oh, holy crap, look how much my team was making off me on Twitch. Look at how much this sponsorship was worth. Why wasn't I part of that? Well, you could have been. We didn't negotiate for that because you only wanted to talk about that salary number.
I have a question along these lines that ties into this. So it goes like this. One of the things is when anyone talks about what should happen or what will happen, etc., I always want to know what the lever is. What's the mechanism that's going to make that happen? So I'm at a loss here because, unfortunately, I don't know the history of like how baseball unions were set up, etc. So maybe I'm about to be completely inaccurate by how I characterize this now. But as far as I can tell, if you go back to any old school setup like that, where players got themselves more rights or better contracts or like different things that they needed given to them, as far as I can tell, it was all on the labor side. Like they unionized, they did the action, they forced the other person to give them something in essentially a negotiation. Now, what's bizarre about esports is what Ryan said there is exactly what my experience has been, is that forget the idea that like players push for this. Players need to have it explained that they're being fucked right now when they are being fucked. Like they aren't even aware of the premise to not be fucked, essentially. They just think everyone's getting wrecked by probably a similar contract I've got. There's probably no difference. And yeah, the only thing they look at is the number higher or lower, and they think that means, like, their version of getting screwed over is they think they got 1,000 less than they should a month. They don't know the version of getting screwed over is they, as you say, they might not have the likeness rights that they might want. They might not have any merchandising potential, which obviously people like tennis players make all their money off. So what my question would be this: at the moment, even some of the little growth and movement we see in the area, as far as I can tell, this must be pretty unique. Almost comes from people who, some, except for you guys where it would directly benefit you, some of the other people, it is people like Noah Winston who actually in some senses are going against their own interests by saying these things should be put forwards, or even like even the angle that, listen, there's certainly an angle you can use, a cynical angle as to why Riot would demand that some sort of a union type thing was set up within LCS, which they then, assigned the lawyers to or whatever. But even so, the idea they would even be the impetus behind that is quite ridiculous, aside from the PR angle and the idea maybe they secretly control it. But this is not really the normal flow of things. So is this not an issue in itself? You expected a bunch of 19-year-olds to have a lot of self-awareness, group together, overlook each other's petty problems, and then look to the greater good and build a greater future. Like, that sounds a bit naive.
Yeah, it has me stuck in a terrible position because there is no question I represent more players than anyone on the planet, and that's just
we've established that, I believe.
Yes,
so.
Attorney advertising.
Yes, but in all seriousness, there is only a handful that care about this stuff, and the reality is Fortnite's changing that. That is the first player base we have that is coming in and saying, whoa, look at how all these independent sponsorships I'm getting that I have to say no to. Why can't I do these? It's the first game we're seeing that in, kind of game wide, and I think the Tfue lawsuit helped a ton with that. But you're right. I mean, Riot has more to gain from that players association than the players do, because it opens the door for things like a draft and a salary cap and all these other things. Which,
again, players aren't aware is obviously something that comes with doing those things, right?
Yeah, a union and a collective bargaining agreement, you give as much as you take. But here, the players are so far away from what is reasonable that they would gain so many life benefits, but the majority just don't really care.
Yeah, and I think, look, the reason it doesn't happen the way that it happens in other sports is our generation of esports guys who got fucked, they just leave. Right. They don't sit around being all miserable and fucking mardy about it, till they hit their 30s and then watch this new generation come up and then go, hey guys, by the way, like, watch out for this. He's still in business. That's the owner that fucked me over back in the day. They just leave. They just go and leave and have lives. So a lot of young players come in blissfully naive, about how bad it can actually be. So the idea of unionizing is probably the last thing on their mind. They probably legitimately think that their team owner will look after them, and Activision Blizzard or Riot Games or whoever's running these franchise leagues, they'll look after you too. It was mind blowing to me to watch Riot basically have to push them. And listen, you know me, I'm a huge critic of Riot down the years, not without reason, but it blows my mind that they literally had to push the players into making the union and say like, hey, could you recommend some lawyers to us? And no one could be asked. They couldn't be bothered. They were just literally like, yeah, suppose, maybe. Now I don't know if there's a bit more to it than that, if these people are kind of a little bit shook at the prospect of, taking control of their own lives and their own destiny. That can be kind of intimidating, especially when there's a lot of power players in the industry that are doing freaky shit that can, create a bunch of problems for you as a player. We all know team owners are still kind of fixing salaries and talking with each other to make sure no one's getting too much.
Yes.
We're not willing to pay this much, so nobody else pay it. Let's stand firm on this ceiling.
An esports classic.
Yeah, and this is at the top, Richard. Think about the amateur leagues.
Oh, mate. I mean, I'm still trying to help out as many amateur players as I can these days as time allows. But dude, that's like trying to fucking stop the tide. That's like being King Canute. You're not going to succeed. We need a big systemic change at the top, and to dare use the phrase trickle down. It's almost like the professionalism has to trickle down.
I got triggered just from even hearing that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, sorry, dude. So that's one thing. So it's definitely naive to expect these young guys to kind of like take charge of their own destiny. But equally as well, for the longest time, it has been in no one's interests. And even now, I'm hugely kind of, I don't like what's going on in the Overwatch League. They have that competitive balance tax, which encourages people to not go over it because then there's a financial penalty for doing so. This in turn impacts on the players' salaries. And yet
it's just the clever way to have a salary cap, basically, right? You technically haven't. If you want to spend $100 million, do it. It's just that if you do so, like, if you're so disincentivized, it basically
in the cynical way that we're still waiting actually for the complete full rule book to be released, and they haven't been transparent about the competitive balance tax. They were talking about releasing that like a year before Nate Nanza left. And he's gone, and
I don't with them. They can't find it.
Yeah, right. But probably had it in his fucking
that shit's
briefcase.
Like the Necronomicon. Like no one knows if it exists, but if it does, you just die if you read it. It's like
So I mean, look, this is definitely a 50-50 thing. I think these orgs, there is that exploitative element we talked about. It's not in their interest. So why are they going to make a beeline to do it beyond PR, beyond looking a bit more professional, beyond maybe being able to do drafts? Because I know Activision Blizzard want to do that for the COD League. They're thinking about it. They really like that idea. But then the players have got to be banging the drum. These are your rights. These are your fundamental player rights, and nobody will look after you. And you can be another guy who goes 10 years through this business and you didn't make your paper and you had a terrible time, and it could have been different. You got to care enough about yourself. So
But they'd rather argue for $500 more a month in most cases.
Yeah, exactly. Or something stupid like, business class flights or a hotel big enough to put a computer in, or can we get tickets for our girlfriends? It's like, you motherfuckers have got to prioritize. Sometimes you are your own worst enemy. And I say that as probably one of the biggest player advocates that we've got in the scene. So, yeah.
Same. It's getting tough. Better. It is. I mean, Bryce, you've probably seen it, that more players are starting to ask for things that make sense long term as the Tfue lawsuit and other people start to wake up to what this can be and how much money's coming in.
Yeah, and content like this, quite frankly, right? Like there are not going to be a ton of pro players that tune in and watch this because most of them are not going to be bothered to tune in for an hour and a half. But there are those examples out there, right? When we put on our Esports Bar Association conference, an LCS player came to watch because he was like, "This is going to be really interesting content. I want to learn." Right? Like he's few and far between, but there are more and more of them. And I think the point that Richard started off with is a really good one, which is a lot of the people who went through these kind of problematic times, who could be passing down their knowledge, just left, right?
All the silenced.
Thing,
I mean, yeah,
right. And then you see, like with what's been happening with Robin and Nip and everything that's been coming out after the fact, right? Like these people who are starting to share that knowledge now, right? There are a number of examples of that, and the key there is having veterans who train the younger folks that are brand new to the ecosystem, right? There's a mentorship component to this, and that's not something that should be overstated, right? Like, it is informal, but there is enormous value there. And if you look at like who heads the player associations in literally every sports league, it is always the vets, because they've been around the block, they've had the opportunity to go through the business, go through several contracts, feel the pain points, and then be able to lead on behalf of the other players. And that's happening on a holistic level at the union, but it's also happening on a micro level at the teams, where the rookies come in and they look up to the vets, they learn from the vets. The vets are, hey, don't do this, and this stupid thing that I did because it's a mistake, right? Like, make sure you're well represented, make sure you're thoughtful about putting your money away, right? Like, don't go to the club every weekend and be popping bottles, like all of this type of stuff, right? And we have different problems to solve in esports, right? By and large, and this is not true for every ecosystem, but by and large, the problem is not esports players going to the club and popping bottles or buying Lamborghinis. No. The problem is that they let their hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars sit in a Bank of America account, accruing point, or PayPal or whatever, right? Like, what we need is a set of veterans who have done that stupid thing, hired financial planners and accountants to make sure that they're putting their money to work for them, that they're actually growing this, large chunk of cash they're making, right? And then they can pass down that form of fiscal responsibility to the younger players, right? So having veterans, I think, will have a big impact on this. We're just still, now there's a real career arc for an esports pro. Like, whenever anyone says to me, an esports pro player's career is really short, I always kind of laugh at that, because I'm like, you have literally no data to support that, right? There's a 20-year history of esports, but for most of that, there wasn't much money to be made here. So you kind of did it early, and then it was like, hey, I got to go get a career where I can support a family and like become an adult. Now you can make, mini games, a lot of money playing professionally, and you could have a much longer career from that as a result. So I think we actually are creating an environment in which there will be veterans who start to advocate for different things in their player contracts, who start to think about fiscal responsibility and, player contracts, but also macro league structure and how players are involved in that process, and start to, organize and advocate for themselves.
It's getting better it's getting better with every game. And I actually think Call of Duty might be the next real thing that happens. League of Legends, to your exact point, those rookies would hear about me yelling on Reddit, come and hire me, show up to the team house. They would see that the veteran already signed their contract without a lawyer, and they would fire me because they thought having a lawyer was rude. That was League of Legends. That's still in large part League of Legends. You come into Overwatch League, that comes out, and every single Overwatch player, save for a handful, called a lawyer and called an agent. That they sought them out. The Overwatch League saw all those horror stories. There were no veterans setting that bad example, and they came in and did things
one thing
the right way.
Not talked enough. They literally put representation, a box for you must fill in who your representative is on your player contract in the Overwatch League. And so if you don't fill that in, you can have NA, but like it's a wait a second, have you thought about this? Like, did you talk to someone before signing? Which is such a small thing, but I actually think makes a profound difference.
But then you go to Fortnite, and you see at Fortnite's the most recent game where not only do they have lawyers and agents, they started looking around at all the other sponsorships in here. They have the Tifus and the Cloaksies coming in and say, before you sign that, look at this 7-figure deal you could have that you're just giving away for $5,000 a month in an apartment in a shitty house. Like this could be your life. This could be your future. Take it seriously. And it's awesome to see that the guys who have been through it in Fortnite are now really mentoring these younger kids. I have so many 13 to 16-year-old clients in Fortnite that are talking to those people up high and hearing what could be better. And it's so good to see, because that is so not the norm.
And so the nice thing from really fast, Duncan, because this is I think a really core point to this, which is, some people would think that you were talking earlier about like Riot, Richard, and these people advocating against their, what seems to be their interests, or Noah Winston's of the world. I don't think these people think of it as against their interests, and I don't think about it as against their interests either. From my perspective, putting more data out into the ether so that players can make these decisions about what is really important to them. You can't know what's really important to you in your contract until you understand all of the dynamics about that and the implications. And what we're starting to get is a world in which more and more people get these things, and the contracts will evolve as a result of that as people change their prioritization and what they're negotiating for. And that's, I think, a point picking up well from where we left off last time. Like, I really do believe the free market helps sort this out. I think the more we can educate the talent base, right? And a similar process happened to the teams, by the way. Like when I first started working with the teams, they had these contracts that were not custom built for esports in any way, shape, or form. They had no really idea what they could or could not cover in these contracts. And so we figured that out together. And over time, the base player contract for a lot of these teams evolved and became something a lot more thoughtful and specific to what they're doing, right? And I think players are going through that exact same iteration right now.
Right. Actually, that ties into something I was going to ask, basically, which is, again, this is where the fact that I don't unfortunately know how the original player unions in sports were set up might actually do me a disservice. But as far as I know, when they first were having those scenarios, it was in baseball. There's the famous incident where basically they just had replacements play, right, at some point in time while they were like waiting for these union things to get sorted out. And the notion was, like, that's an area of like, oh, well, can the owner just replace you with Bill who works in the bakery? Like, will someone still come and watch him? Right? As far as I can tell, doesn't esports have a way worse version of that? Because the difference is, if we're in an old-timey scenario where I have a team in, pick a random city in America, San Francisco, I have some baseball team there, and my baseball team goes on strike or they're unionizing, and at the moment I'm going to use replacements, it probably is going to be some, like, at best semi-pro player who I can get, who isn't somehow currently contracted elsewhere, but is available in this city or nearby to come and play. It's such a limited talent pool. You could easily see that, like, I imagine the original player is going to be much better. Whereas the problem is at the moment, not only do they not even need to go to a totally separate class, you can just say to one person you're negotiating with, well, if you don't like the contract, I'll talk to the other guy I was talking to. But then even if you had unionization of, say, the top 500 players in a game, there are so many people trying to get into these games, and you start online that, like, the difference between the number one person and the 501 person, 501st, wouldn't be as significant, I feel, as the baseball example I gave before. So is that not a problem? Because again, the problem there to me is, like, unless it comes from the player side, you don't really have leverage there. Like, the owners can be nice, can be great guys and say, we want this to exist in esports, but that's almost a luxury, surely.
That is why we haven't seen a lot of players' associations or unions, because anytime there is that unique or rare player who stands up and says, hey, we deserve better, they immediately get told, especially 5 years ago, they were told, if you get a lawyer, if you do this, you're gone, and there's 100 people behind you, so goodbye. I think that's becoming less true. I think that the reason the first lawsuit we saw was now with Tfue is because we're finally seeing players that are as strong as a team. Tfue has more of a following than half of the esports orgs out there, and he can go out and really stand up for his rights without fear of being thrown to the wayside. Fortnite is a game that allows for that because there is no franchise model yet. There is no any kind of anything there yet. And these individual stars are kind of sitting there saying, what the hell is this team doing for me? Why do teams exist? And teams are at the same time having their own conversations for the same way, reevaluating what they can offer and how they can help be mutually beneficial again with these players. But outside of the franchise model, that's where we're going to see the first real pushes like this, because they don't have to worry about losing their roster spot. They are the roster.
I actually totally disagree with that.
Awesome.
I think, well, so, I mean, the first half of it makes sense, but the second half of it, you lost me, right? Like, I will bet you all of the money in my pocket. I'll bet you my law firm against your law firm, right? As you
deal.
Reasonable. How many times does this come up? I know, every time when they're playing Smash Brothers, everything.
Yeah, Ryan owes me his law firm like 10 times over.
There we go.
Because T. Martin and Pro Syndicate aren't in jail yet.
They're going.
Reasonable.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, the part I really
H2K is not an org anymore, so you owe me for that. But anyway, continue.
We digress. Anyway, look, I mean, the part I disagree with is where you say that the type of organization is going to happen outside of the franchise model versus inside. It will for sure happen inside, right? Like, there are too many benefits associated with the franchise model for getting players more organized, right? It's a finite team base, and therefore
it would also be a more obvious who you would gather as the group, all the players of that league, right? I feel like it is a natural
it's a really natural line drawing exercise, which is super important because, like, the CSPPA is doing a lot of work, but it's really hard to determine, like, who gets in, who gets out, how do we have relative decision-making power? We want to include everybody. Like, the first esports union will for sure be stood up in a franchise league.
Yeah, totally agree. And what I was saying is that the people, I said making a push outside of the franchise model like this, someone like Tfue, who doesn't have to worry about being cut and out of the game, we're going to see a lot more stuff like this Tfue lawsuit then we're way before we're going to see
right. He has more leverage, obviously, individually in that sense, because he can't be replaced in the league.
Well, but I totally agree. A union's going to happen, it has to happen in a franchise model, like for sure.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, right? Like Tifu's lawsuit is a perfect example of why like litigation as dispute resolution in sports does not work. Litigation, even on an expedited version of it, takes forever. We're talking years, right? Which is a lifetime in the world of professional sports. And so there's a reason why you see major sports leagues and now major esports leagues adopting alternative dispute resolution, where if there is some massive grievance between a player and a team, there is a specific way of resolving that is much faster, right? That is built into part of the ecosystem of the league, because you simply cannot rely on courts to actually solve these problems.
Yes, the gist for people who've missed it there is this is actually the real loophole, that if you could go back in time, my joke always was, all you'd actually have to do to go back in time and run esports is just know that nobody ever does go to court. Like if you knew that and you were there from day one, you'd be fucking running riot for the next 15 years. Like not in the literal sense there, obviously.
Or pop dog.
So this basically, like in that, let me think where I was going with that. So the gist of it basically is like the reason why even a sports league can't rely on courts like that is like if I'm in a dispute with my star player, it's to no one's benefit if this gets resolved 3 years later when his contract was for 4 years. And in the meantime we had 3 seasons. Like no one wants that. Like we'd all rather know where we stand and play or not play.
Yes, 100%.
Also coinciding with all this is the brands are starting to see the ROI in esports. There was always the jersey sponsor, not always, but there's been jersey sponsors, there's been league sponsors. Brands are just starting to really get like, oh, we can sponsor a streamer and get a huge return. Different return than a team, but a huge return. Sometimes way bigger, sometimes smaller, but great. I don't want to argue about that for 10 hours with Bryce, which is why I gave that.
I'm not arguing. I'm just constantly impressed by your ability to slip in subtle advertising for your businesses as you go.
No, I'm not. They call the players directly. I'm just saying the players are starting to see like they're getting the emails that say, "Hey, we'll pay you 120 grand a year to just put this thing on your overlay. We'll give you 7 figures to give a shout out of our company online." They're starting to see that conversation, which they never did before, because the orgs would have the org email in their Twitter bio, or just brands wouldn't look at the player. They would call TSM directly. So as that changes, it's just going to kickstart the fight for rights here.
I mean, I think it's a question of scale, right? It's something we talked about last time where, you and I have had this debate online at times where, let's fiat for a second that like life-changing money means 7 figures. I get your point is well taken that for some people, $100,000 is life-changing money. Absolutely, it is, right? For many people, for the majority of people, in fact. Right?
I would take it.
But if we're talking about right, like deals of that size, 5 years ago, there was literally no esports player on the planet that reached a level of scale where it made any sense for a mainstream non-endemic brand to talk to them, because they just didn't have scale. For these people, obviously you can't justify paying them $1 million. And if a fair deal there is $50,000, it's like not worth the brand's time, right? Like they're allocating tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in sponsorship buy. So as scale increases around the pro players, it does change the dynamics around sponsorships, right? We talked on the last show about how teams became aggregators of sponsorship inventory, and that's because literally the only way you could strike a lot of these deals is if you put all these pieces together. And if you had a whole bunch of individuals out in the marketplace trying to independently sell themselves, they would not have been successful because they were too small.
That's one of those things, by the way. In light of the TFU shit, like I've heard many times colloquially on shows people use that analogy of like an esports org's really just like an agent. Now you just imagine how many owners must be wondering, like, am I in a video somewhere with my company based in California saying on camera that I'm kind of like an agent? Like, let me just run through those VODs again. Does anyone have that? Like, that might end up meaning more than I thought at the time.
It's true, though. What my agency would offer a tier 1 Fortnite player is very similar to what an org would offer. And that line's becoming more and more blurred the more that genre of esport or whatever, entertainment, whatever you want to call it, continues to grow. That'll never be true in a franchise model. But to your point, Bryce, of what is life-changing money, I would say if you can double someone's salary in a year, that is life-changing money. And there is a large number of Overwatch pros making $50K to $100K a year that if they were allowed to get their own sponsorships would easily make another $50 to $100K a year. And that's not happening because they're not allowed to. And I think the more and more they're realizing that that's the reality, they're going to be fighting harder for those categories.
Yeah, I even have a good analogy for you here, like a sports example that I don't know if you're aware of, but a couple of years ago, as the UFC was getting huge and it got its big TV deal, they famously did a deal with Reebok for all the clothing branding, etc. And they made it a part of a UFC contract that everyone who is in the UFC is sponsored by Reebok, is required to like wear the Reebok stuff, all the rest of it. But crucially, Reebok now is their sponsor. And so what happened was, in the UFC, basically, as far as I know about the business, the prime time to actually be a UFC fighter was like the couple of years before this came in, when it was still huge, but you could have all your own personal sponsors. And so there was people who've literally said, like, not even the champions, by the way, who would say, listen, I used to have a patch that was on the arse of my shorts that I was getting 100k for, but when I got the Reebok deal, because it was a scale thing and it was a mass booked deal with the whole company, now I'm maybe on 25k with the same thing. And the key thing is there's no negotiation there. Like, I'm fitted at wherever I am in the UFC system. I'm not going with my agents. And again, you know, if I have a brilliant agent and I have the great brand personally, maybe I get a way better deal as, like, you know, the fifth best fighter than a champion might in a different division if he's not marketable. So like you can see in esports, we're trying to go the other way around. In something like the UFC, they're going backwards in terms of progress in that sense.
Oh yeah,
well,
sure,
the interesting example there, right, is you're talking about the like super marketable player who can go get the bigger deal on their own, but then there's a number of fighters for whom the golden era for them would have actually been in a world of the Reebok deal because they're experiencing some of the financial upside associated with that, and they might not have been able to get any deal or as good of a deal on their own, right? And that's the natural dynamic. Like, you know, to Ryan's Overwatch League example, like part of what's being paid for, part of the current basis of all the salaries is the premise that you have signed over this bundle of sponsorship rights to the team. If you take those back, right, so that you can go monetize on your own, that is okay, right? Like, there's a way of making the economics of that work. But if you do that, your salaries will go down. Your salary does not stay, and then you give, if assuming all the other things in the market stay the same, right? Level of viewership, popularity, all this other stuff stays flat. If you want more rights, your compensation should go down, right? Because now the team, which was gonna recoup some of what they paid for you and by selling sponsorships with those rights, no longer can, right? That's how the market works.
I don't know any team that would agree to that. That's just you saying that. You know, that conversation has never happened. No players ever signed their salary saying this is 10K higher because I'm giving up sponsorship rights. No owner's ever said that in a negotiation. And if I went to an owner and I said, pay us 10K less, but I get to go get a clothing sponsorship for this guy, I'd get told to go to hell.
Yeah,
so I mean, that's a nice thing to say.
That's just not true, right? You and I literally have had conversations with team owners in which you guys have been talking with me around negotiations around certain talent and basically saying, yeah, like, I made you an offer, you just didn't like how much less it was in exchange to get those rights back. So that's
literally never happened. No, that is
right. If you bet your company's on it. Bet your company's.
Yeah, no, but I mean that's just categorically untrue that an owner's ever offered. You're saying an owner offered me less salary for one of my players in exchange for open salary rights.
I was a part of the conversation.
Are you talking about the moderator of our last panel outside that he jokingly said that?
I would never relay that information.
Yeah, okay. So that is like
it's unfalsifiable.
I can't. I mean, I'm not going to put.
Yeah, of course.
I'm not going to put him on.
You're talking about one owner that wasn't part of a negotiation.
Let's talk about it from a perspective that we really can talk about it, right? Which is you can actually look at pro players in many different esports that have secured independent sponsorship rights, right? That have deals with their teams, and the way we know this is because you can look at them doing individual activations along the way, right? And that is, Ryan, that is a natural give and take, right? They got those rights in exchange for something. Maybe they got those rights in exchange for not increasing their salary or not increasing their salary as much as they otherwise would have, but that is literally how this works. You're getting something.
Or maybe it was even a bargaining chip as part of a deal. You know, I won't go to this org if you give me this.
Yeah, 100%.
But and maybe that's true for people you're aware of. But even then, that is not true in my experience. The players that we have that are doing independent sponsorships are on the same salaries, have the same salary negotiation, have the same salary conversation, are still the same market value on their salaries. We just do independent sponsorships outside of the categories that are already reserved by teams. And we have a conversation with the owner, but the owner's never said, yes, you can do that side sponsorship in exchange for a salary reduction or exchange for a different conversation come negotiation time. Those two worlds have never been conflated in my clients' heads. And I've never heard an owner bring that up in a negotiation once ever, save for that cigarette conversation once.
I mean, this is literally how like economics and business works, right? Like it's no parts of a deal are isolated from each other. You're signing one contract and there's a bunch of terms that go in that contract. If we were to instead say you get no rights at all, right? Like you have absolutely no right to go seek independent sponsorships. You would come back and say like, okay, if you're doing that, like my guy's giving up X amount, I want a bigger number. Instead, it's okay. This is the rights that you get. These are the rights that we're keeping. And there's a number that makes sense based on those factual realities, whether or not you're expressly having. Right, but whether or not you're expressly saying like, okay, I'm saying yes to this, but if I took these away, I would ask for more money, right? That's just implied, how it all works.
Sure. No, because well, of course, that's basic. Yes, that sentence is accurate. But what I'm saying is no owner would give us sponsorship rights in exchange for a lower salary because I know and you know how much they're making on those sponsorship rights. The salary is negligent compared to that. And then on the flip side, I
like the way you guys never actually agree with each other. You just basically say like, what you just said is technically correct, but I don't fuck with your whole vibe though, sir. I don't fuck with your vibe.
he basically said he's arguing by saying contracts are an overall deal. Yes, I agree with that. But the overall conversation here isn't happening because the orgs know how much they're making on sponsors. I opened the show by saying my players don't really know or care. And that's why this honest conversation negotiation is not happening. It's a completely isolated salary discussion and then a completely isolated sponsorship discussion. Because even with my side sponsorships we're allowed to do for our guys with reserved categories, it's not hitting the bigger pool there. And the teams are coming away with so much on those team-wide sponsorships that they're happy to pay whatever salary to get the conversation done.
How can you literally just said in 2 sentences, I don't know how much they're making off of these deals. And
no, I didn't. When did I say that?
You said, I started off by saying, I don't know how much money they're generating off of those days.
Play the tape back.
You started with saying, wait, Ryan, let me just ask this cross-examination for a second. Do you know how much money teams make on their team-wide deals?
I've seen many, yeah. I don't have an idea of. I don't know what I don't know the overall number on every single deal a team's done, but I've seen enough team deals, yeah.
Okay, so you feel like you have a sense of how much money
the ballpark
teams make on these deals?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and then you know roughly how much money your players are giving up if they had these full rights on their own because you sell enough independent player deals, right? So like if the player had full sponsorship rights, you know roughly how much money those rights are worth, and you can say like Double Lift's rights are worth more than Kusta's rights because he's a
why the shot at Scott?
It was just a random name that popped into my head, right? I'll take some.
They're both being in CLG. I see the connection.
Yeah, it was just random. It was literally just the first. Fair. But you know, like the relative value, right? Not exactly because you can't know until you're in the market selling, but you know how much player X is worth relative to player Y, right?
If your next sentence is going to be, so then why don't you negotiate the whole deal that way?
Wait,
I opened the show by, but I'm going to jump ahead of your thought here.
No, I'm asking questions.
It's because I opened the show.
Yeah. Remember to never concede anying, even if you actually agree with that statement.
Okay, so I would like permission to treat Ryan as a hostile witness. No, look, I mean, you have all of the data, right?
Sure.
And you're literally.
I have enough data. Yeah, and you would say, why don't I fight harder for this? And I open the show by saying why. The players care about their salary. That's it.
Yeah, so like at the end of the day, I think part of the reason where you lose me on this argument is like I don't even know what we're arguing about because you're literally representation for these players, and if they don't care about it, then like where are we going? You cannot possibly tell me that there is no way to get a deal done where a player gets more independent sponsorship rights if we live in a world in which your talent literally doesn't care enough for you to advocate about that and does not care enough to potentially walk from deals over it, right? Maybe you have had
we have
this is something
in Fortnite.
That you care about. Okay.
No, in Fortnite we've walked from many deals over independent sponsorship rights. So I opened the show by saying the majority of players don't care, but this new crop really does.
When you've walked from deals over it, then you've walked them into deals where they got these rights, correct?
Yeah, of course.
So you're saying it's on the table.
And I'm saying it's the same exact salary offer at both teams. The salary is isolated because it's so far removed from what the team sponsors are getting. I always said it was on the table. It's just two different conversations.
What do you mean it's removed from what the team? It's literally part of the inventory.
Yeah, I mean, technically, he did say that, like, what he had never heard was someone explicitly saying, I will give you 10K less in exchange for these. Like, he's never heard it formalized, basically.
When we negotiate for those independent sponsorship rights, it's the same as when I'm negotiating to lower the amount they can be fined, to lower the duration of the contract, to make a nicer team house. It's all kind of treated as ancillary benefits, completely removed from the overall salary, at least in all the negotiations I've been part of. We negotiate salary and then all the other deals. And it's the independent sponsorships rights are part of that. I agree with you. At the end of the day, a contract is looked at as a whole and an overall value is placed to that. But I based on what I know, based on my experience, it's treated just differently right now because the teams are all trying to figure out where they can make the most money as the streaming deals change and the sponsorship deals change and whatever. The whole industry is shifting on what a deal looks like.
I've got a question for you, right? So one area, since I gave the example earlier about how sports is obviously so different from how esports is handled in terms of setting these things up and all the market pressures, etc., and how many people can replace you, I could actually see a different angle to where you could get to a better place in esports without directly leveraging people. And the example I would give would be the famous one a few years ago where PEA tried to get set up in Counter-Strike to be this professional league, which was basically going to be owned and run by the teams that were in the league, essentially. And what happened was the players who were contracted to those teams were the people who basically ruined the deal, because what they did was they used the leverage that players are more popular with fans of a team than the team itself is against the team. And what happened was the team owners realized, even though absolutely it's probably within my rights to force you to do this because you are my employee, even that's obviously technical language I shouldn't have used, but you know what I mean, the gist of it. You are the contractor working under me with a contract. In this scenario, like, there's no point being against my fans and my own players. Like, that's a terrible look for everyone. So in this scenario, it actually did make the owners back off and basically just stop the whole project at that point in time. Now, what I would say along those lines is, this is another area where I could actually see making improvements in the industry just by pressuring the power players to do this for fear of the fact that if you don't do it, what does that imply about you as a company and your org? So what you could do is this, like you just said about how in the Overwatch League, you have to have the box where even though you can write not available for your representative, it's the equivalent of when you're going to delete something off your computer and it says, are you sure you want to delete that? And you do that quick thing of like, wait a minute, was I trying to click the right thing there? Or was I just moving it to the side? I didn't want to delete that. Good. Like, in the same sense, if we just put pressure on owners to be like, well, everyone in the LCS, every player who joins their team has to have an agent before they even do, or they have to have a lawyer who's checked the contract before they're allowed to sign it. Now, that wouldn't be like a legal thing you could force them to do, but if you put the social pressure, a lot of owners love to spout that thing about corporate values and stuff. It'd be hard to go against that, I feel. Because here's the thing, right? I'm totally fine, as I said, with if that PEA team had said, listen, end of the day, boys, cut all the bullshit. I'm your boss. I'm telling you to do this. If you don't do it, then you're not doing what I say in the and we'll go down that route. But they didn't want to do that because they'd set up this whole atmosphere that that's not who they are. So it went counter to that narrative. So I feel like that would be a very heavy pressure you could put on them, actually, even though it's just implied.
I love that.
I was going to say some of the biggest proponents of these supposed corporate values are the people that fucking violate them in the most egregious fashion. In my experience,
some of it is the left hand, like going, look at what I'm doing over here. Don't look at the right hand.
Yeah, exactly. Don't look at the right hand. The right hand's the one with the knife in. So yeah, I'm not right. I don't know. I mean, look, there's a lot to be said for kind of like almost like the kind of corporate shaming, like, you don't do this and this organization does. But I think in general, what you have to understand is you're not coming up against independent business entities that are competing with each other. They are to a certain degree. But if you look at, say, for example, North America and esports, these owners, they're relatively pally with each other. They talk. They have regular meetings. They hang out. They price fix against the players.
So their interest too, as you said, right?
Yeah, and the reason, so the idea that, you're ever going to get like a bunch of organizations come out and effectively shame people that they're having dinner with at fucking 4:00 or meeting for a game of fucking racquetball on the weekends, no, it ain't going to work like that. I mean, this is why, what I've been doing and digging into all of this shit and what, and when players feel empowered to speak up, that's way more important because
sure.
that goes to the fans. And then when the fans get on your back, now you got to scramble, because unfortunately, and I don't want to give mobs too much power, but there's a truth to this. Whether or not what you do, when you're using a hashtag or whatever, whether you're a fan to begin with or someone who's going to actively do a boycott, the sponsors then pressurize the owners to sort shit out. Yeah.
Listen, to that exact point, I'm certainly no stranger to inciting mobs. I mean, that's why I'm not invited to most esports dinners anymore. I mean, the only power I had when I started. Hell yeah. The only power I had when I started in this industry, when I saw a player truly being taken advantage of, truly being exploited, like by every negative definition of that word, was to go on Twitter or Reddit and say, look at what this org's doing. Look at, can you believe what this owner is doing to this player? And then Reddit and Twitter or whoever else would jump on and pile on. I think it's a huge testament to not my maturity. I haven't grown up. I think what's happened is North American esports has grown up. There's a difference between players being taken advantage of and orgs just not being fair. And I think right now there's a lot of things aren't so fair in North America, but they're definitely better. There's no more like evil owner like there was 5 years ago, at least at the tier 1 level. There's still plenty at tier 2 and tier 3. But the problems and the emergencies and me calling Riot and begging for a conference at 2 a.m. because of some fire, it just doesn't happen as much anymore, because really this scene has a lot of the bad actors. They've changed roles. They're out into other worlds now. They're, wherever you can find them on LinkedIn, but they're not running orgs anymore. And I think
unfortunately,
that's just,
unfortunately, my suspicion in regards to that point is this. And again, I might be wrong, but I'm a cynical guy by nature. I think as more and more money has come in, that the power structure that we've got in place now is actually a lot better at hiding the issues and a lot better at kind of like channeling the evil. So it's not just like here's a team owner, here's a player, team owner bullies player, team owner gives player unfair contract. Eventually the player speaks up or the contract expires and then they speak up, or some DMs get leaked and it proves the owner was doing the bad thing, and we play it out in the public field. I mean, what we've got now is we have a developer. Developer brings in the owners and says, listen, I'm going to let you have a piece of this massive pie, but we're all going to get rich together, but we all got to get our shit in line. And we're not getting our shit in line for the good of esports, because fuck esports. You think Activision Blizzard really care about esports? They've been fucking neglecting it for how many years? Now that the VC money's here, all of a sudden, hey, we invented this shit, didn't we? Let's go get our piece. So they get all of the fucking guys, like little lieutenants of fucking evil, all of the team owners. I mean, I like team owners ostensibly, right? But let's imagine them as lieutenants of evil in a hierarchical demonic structure, just for a moment. Just to
I've got the same. Yeah, I've got the same.
Just fucking.
It's a stretch, but let's go. Yeah.
So they all then are in line with them, and then now we need other people, because it's like we almost have to kind of like dupe the players into thinking they're getting the deal that they need. Meanwhile, of course, everything, you're in a bubble. You're in the Overwatch bubble. I don't mean in a business perspective. I don't mean in an economic perspective. I'm talking about it's hermetically sealed off. And now, and again, this is no disrespect to either of you guys, because I like you both. But now the agents are in, and when I see one agency effectively like having ties to the team owners, having represented the team owners, and now they also are representing not just a player or two players or a team or two teams, they represent pretty much all of them. Yeah. And now you're funneling them into this league system, which I know isn't great. I know the salary isn't on point. I know the housing's atrocious. I know that these players in the Overwatch League are burning out after 2 seasons, because you've got a never-ending season, because Activision Blizzard's metric for success right now is just hours viewed. Like, we've got to keep just pushing this, manipulate that number at all costs.
That is the darkest metric of all time as well.
Of course it is. So while I agree with what you're saying, Ryan, that maybe it's not like bad at the fucking days when I was fucking, first digging into this shit, I feel like sometimes, and I really hope this doesn't hurt your feelings, it doesn't affect our friendship.
No.
I think, I think sometimes even the agents that are advocating for the players have this bug in their ear about how it's better to get them a piece of something than be too vocal, too, fucking rebellious, and then they end up getting nothing at all. And you unwittingly are in a tier in this like pyramid of kind of like almost like super clever exploitation, I think.
You're totally right.
Man.
Yeah, you're totally right. I'm in a, no, seriously. I mean, like, it doesn't hurt, but it doesn't hurt feelings at all. Like, I'm in a really tough position here to be able to represent players and negotiate for them in a way where I'm still able to help the next one, where I do have to play nice with a lot of the owners. And to be fair, I've done trademarks for Complexity. I've done trademarks for Valiant. I've worked with one owner who's no longer an owner on a deal 5 years ago. That's it, though. I mean, we don't go around representing. Bryce and I many years ago drew the line of who's doing what. But I am friends with most owners. I go to their dinners. I'm going to one of their weddings soon. We get along, and I promise you I wouldn't be doing that if they were really taking advantage of these players. The problem I have is still trying to convince my players to fight for the stuff that, okay, we're not sleeping on the floor anymore. Okay, I'm allowed to have my girlfriend visit. I'm allowed to have a social life. That's solved, and now we feel like we've won. We haven't won. Like, there are millions of dollars being kept at the top that should be funneling down. And my biggest problem is absolutely trying to play nice with everybody so we can be in the room and get these players anything, but also being able to get the players to give a crap about all that other stuff. And it's a tough thing. It really is. But I'm the first to admit I walk that line a lot more than other agents too. There are agents in the space that are, blacklisted where they're not allowed to represent players. Some of them are truly bad agents that were just trying to take 10 to 30% and disappear. Others just negotiated as hard as they should have and were out of the industry. And it's a really tough line. It's really an uncomfortable place to be in here. The benefit I have is I'm also an attorney, and I have a legal obligation to represent these guys as hard as I can, and I do. I sleep very easy at night on that, and I have been the first one to call out the truly bad actors when I see them. I mean, again, the last truly egregious thing that I've dealt with was with H2K, and I was not shy about that. But now I see how much money is kept at the top and how much stuff is not being shared down below. And I can't have that fight until my clients care more. I can't just go on Reddit and say, look at all this and rub people's noses in it when I'm the only one trying to.
Sure.
So I think something from your last phrasing, Ryan, was really important, which is all this money at the top. And I want to be really clear about where that money actually is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions publicly and maybe on this call as well. That money is not sitting at the team level. Like, teams are not cash cows. Teams are not like, this is why when people are talking about teams exploiting players, I'm always just kind of like, oh God, I just don't see that at all, because, by and large,
I mean, the team's losing money.
Most of the team owners are public about the fact that they are losing money on a year-over-year level, right? We can talk about enterprise value, and we did it a little bit on the last episode.
They say they are, sure.
Sure. I mean, like, look, I'm looking at the data, right? I get to see the data you're looking at, and I get to see the data that I'm looking at, right?
So just
if you just know some of the salaries, like some of them couldn't be making money. If you just look at some of the
course. And this is what I mean, right?
It.
So just to that point, right? Like, and this is what I mean. Like, again, love you, Bryce. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to talk about losing money like we're talking about a mom and pop store, right? What we're talking about here is VC companies coming in and owning stuff. And they're saying, like, hey, we got 3 or 5 years of just cycling these fucking, hey, we've done another raise. Hey, we've done another raise. Hey, here's another 20 million. Here's another 40 million. Here's another 6 million. None of these owners really give a fuck about where this goes, because typically they've either already been bought out up front, or they have massive shares, or both. And, and at the end, if the VC firm pulls out and goes, well, yeah, this is a bust, actually, this is never going to be worth the same as an NFL franchise. They've had a salary the entire time. They've already got theirs. They've already got shares at the end for any sale, which will get, roughly a proportion of it back. So, yeah, of course they're hemorrhaging cash, but it's like you're playing with house money. And that's how they think about it. And it's very evident in a lot of the business decisions that they make.
So I think that there are elements of truth to what you just said, but I think at the core really disagree with it, right? I think that the owners are deeply invested in whether or not this works out as a long-term economic proposition by and large. And
I might have undersold that a little bit. Yeah, that's a fair comment.
So the number of owners that have cashed out in a really material way, right? Like taking life-changing money off the table. I mean, we can count them on literally one hand, right? Like it's a pretty small club of people. There's another hand of people who've taken some small amount of money off the table, right? When we're talking about have they drawn a salary along the way? Yeah, are they making as much money they would make if they were doing the same job in another industry? No, probably not, right? Like, generally speaking, these are all still kind of in startup mode. And so you sacrifice short-term compensation in exchange for long-term upside. As it relates to what happens when when some of these businesses run out of opportunities for money. Well, it really depends on when they run out and who's running out of money. But I promise you, okay, some of these teams are just going to fail in every way, right? They will run out of money. No one will want to give them more money. No one wants to buy them. And we're talking about shuttered doors. Everybody lost all their money, right? And when that happens, the owner that never really materially cashed out, that has been taking lower than market compensation for years, basically hoping to build something, like, they have now just lost out on that in the same way their investors have lost out on that, right? Along the way, every player that they paid, in often cases, inflated salaries because there was a bidding war created as a result of a lot of additional investment capital pouring in the space, they just cashed the checks the whole way. And that's what I'm trying to bring attention to. Now, there is enormous upside in this business. I am not saying these are mom and pop shops. This is about reinvesting into the growth. And for some of these teams that are going to win, they're going to win massive. And the owners that had whatever their financial interest was, even if it's getting diluted along the way from an investment perspective, if they start with a meaningful chunk, they're going to get a meaningful payday at the end when they exit the business, right? So I am not in any way saying that does not exist. That's not a thing. I just want to be really clear that, like, these people that we're talking about, not all of them are going to win big. Some of them will fail big, and is in no way a foregone conclusion that they're, like, at getting to the end of this rainbow and walking off as millionaires. And they're the ones that are taking the risk, right? They're the ones that are, like, building the business and going out and doing all these things and slogging the trenches for under market compensation. So I just want to be really clear. Now, the core point I wanted to start with on this is, who is making all of this money, the people who are printing the money, are by and large the game publishers, right? That is where the value is really being captured in this ecosystem. And I wrote a white paper like 5 years ago, and it was, I think, one of the first things where Ryan and I started talking, in which I hypothesized that the true collective bargaining in the space is going to be teams and players versus publishers, because publishers are capturing such a large amount of the value that, while it is fair, and there's reason, Ryan and I can reasonably disagree about some of this stuff, and we'll continue to hash out, and it's a little bit of a zero-sum game between players and teams as it relates to whatever part of the economics they have captured at the time. As it relates to capturing a bigger piece of the pie, I think player and team interests are actually core aligned. And that's why I think you do see some team owners strongly advocating for players to, have, to be more thoughtful about that stuff and to organize. Because to Duncan's point about, like, the leverage players had around the PEA situation, right? Imagine if that you harness that collective power with the team's collective power in order to engage in negotiation with the publisher, saying, hey, we want some percentage, like, you must make skins including us, and you must
obvious example would be
whatever,
someone
right?
like a Riot, where again they've made so many pleas to the community that they're good guys who are looking out for the players. Like, it would just look so bad if all the players collectively said, like, we get an unfair deal from Riot, or something along those lines. Would obviously, like, again, you could style it out, but it'd be hard.
But the thing that it's the lieutenant. We're back to the fucking leader and the lieutenants, right? Anything like that going on behind the scenes, and I agreed with everything Bryce said right until that last sentence, by the way. Anything that goes on behind the scenes, and I know this goes on from my experience, the representatives and the developers go, can you just get your fucking players in line? Can you just bring them in line? Can you not just bring them in line? Like, after everything we've done for you, and the inducements, the incentives to do that, to basically, like, bamboozle the players to a certain degree and make them act against their best interests, that it's almost rewarded. Because, look, the Morgan Stanley report boasted about how little salary they had to pay the players. It was a selling feature for the league. They had an entire chapter on it saying, this is what an NFL salary percentage looks like. Oh, look, 52% of all the revenue goes. And then, remember the shutouts in the NBA? 54 they were up to. These wily players, and trying to get their value. And then next to it, 10% for the Overwatch players. And they were going, you see, with these types of margins, we can all have a very good time if you invest in it. And that kind of inducement is going on. And that's unconscionable. It's so the idea that, like, players and owners are going to come together. What you're asking is that these owners, who are the real stakeholders, players are 10 a penny. Like,
put it this way.
They've made it clear in the Overwatch League, they don't even care if they have the best 500 players, as long as they have 500 players.
In other games, though, if you do that same math problem, like in the LCS or a Tier 1A Counter-Strike, it would not be that. In fact, it would not shock me if you told me that total LCS salaries all combined was over 50% of revenue generated by those teams in exchange for those rights.
Okay. Well, what I would say is this, Richard. Basically, one of the points you just made there is, again, one of the slogans I always have currently about the franchise leagues that exist, which, again, even the word franchise is colloquial usage there, but whatever, we all know what it means. So when we talk about LCS and Overwatch League, I always say this: when you're a random person in the public looking at this and you're thinking something along the lines of well, what's happening to the player here and what's going on? It's what about the fans? Why aren't the fans getting it? And I always tell people, you're not the customer of the Overwatch League. The fucking team who bought the slot is. As soon as everyone starts making money, someone else can be the customer. Right now, the person who paid $20 million is the primary customer of Blizzard. The person who paid the LCS purchase fee, the $10 million, is the customer. So as a result, like Richard's saying there, at the moment, the person who's going to appeal to someone in that battle between game dev, team and player isn't going to be player and org versus the game dev. I'd love if it was, Bryce. At the moment, it's way more likely that the game dev's the one who says to the owner, here's how we can fuck them even more. I'll help you.
Yeah, and in my experience, that's basically where that's the alliance that's being forged. It's when you've got Blizzard executives literally lying about how many top-level pro players there are, right, and saying, oh, yes, absolutely, these players, there's 10,000 players playing at a pro level, absolute nonsense. But the reality is, when you see these types of leagues, they don't care. They don't even necessarily want the best players in there. If you're not brand friendly, out you go. You're a bit too vocal about those contracts, out you go. Why do you think the people who were getting fucked over at Washington, D.C. By Kate or whatever her fucking name was?
Justice one, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Justice. Washington Justice.
Kate Mitchell, I believe it was.
Yeah. Why do you think we still haven't had anything openly said about that? What about the coach in the Overwatch League who is completely misrepresenting their credentials and actually lying about the teams that they've coached at and is still currently coaching players, and everybody knows it and nobody's saying anything about it? You don't say anything because then the owners are going to get told by Activision Blizzard they've got to go. You get XQC'd, you're just out the league. That's the worrying alliance that's going on, and it's very, very bad for players because the team owners should have a duty of care to them. But if it's a choice between, hey, if you don't bring your players in line, we might go with another owner when the bidding comes up. We might actually just buy you out of your franchise slot like it says we can in the contract. So yeah, you absolutely don't want to get on the wrong side of the developers if you want a big slice of what you think is going to be a cash cow, and if that comes at the expense of one or two players, boo-hoo. That's how the average owner thinks. I
think you're describing really common bargaining dynamics that we see in a number of different industries, and it's the big distinction, in traditional sports, The reason why the pathway of player representation with the way that it was because the teams in the league were one entity and they were the one capturing the majority of the value. And so over time, it was players saying, we should, we need to see the table. We need a bigger piece of the pie. We need to see the table. We need a bigger piece of the pie. And over time, they gain more leverage by going about things the right way, organizing, leveraging their collective fan bases, right? Hiring attorneys, hiring representatives, et cetera. So first of all, I think that the dynamic you're describing, I don't see it as nefarious as you do. You and I are probably working from fundamentally different data sets. My guess is there's things know that I don't, for sure. And I think that's
absolutely vice versa, by the way.
Right?
Absolutely vice versa.
So I don't see it as nearly that nefarious in the Overwatch League specifically. I definitely don't see it as that nefarious in some other major esports. Certainly, we have to mention that there's, Valve esports, right? Where Valve is certainly not, there is no collaboration whatsoever between Valve and anyone, let alone the team owners to screw over the players, right?
Always the best thing about Valve. I always give that analogy. It's totally. Listen, if the other leagues and game devs are all the overbearing parent, Valve's just the one with the latchkey kids. That's the best thing about them. They're just not home. They're not doing anything good or bad. They're just not home.
Totally. I think in the Riot ecosystem where you look at player salaries that continued to balloon, there was no, soft salary cap or equivalent to the one you described for the Overwatch League in that ecosystem. The median salary in the league or the average salary in the league is over $300,000, right? There's a lot, and they stood up the player organization and said we're going to do. It's not. It's the mean stat. So of course
it isn't mean.
any mean, any average is.
I understand how average.
What we need is the total dollars earned by everyone in the whole league, just as one big number with no breakdown whatsoever. I think that would be the best metric if we could get to that, guys.
I think we literally have that metric. Multiply the number.
Probably do. Yeah.
Reported recently, it's like 300 and I think it said 320,000 or whatever. Multiply it by 50, and you got your number, Thorin.
There you go.
So look, I don't think the dynamic is quite like you're saying, but I think my core point really stands, which is you're describing, Richard, how you feel like it works right now and the way in which the publisher might be using their level of control and authority in the ecosystem to really lean on organizations to behave a certain way. But over time, as we saw in the history of traditional sports, the parties that are not capturing as high a percentage of the value continue to push for their interests, organize, get better at it, and ultimately pull more power if they're really adding meaningful value to the ecosystem, which I believe both teams and players do. So that's why I continue to believe that's where this is ultimately going, regardless of where it is right now. And I think reasonable minds can disagree about that.
But it's only because of the franchise system. I mean, you look at a game like Fortnite that doesn't have a franchise system or an actual need for teams, and you saw the players run right by the teams, and they're arguing for their rights directly with Epic and doing things directly on their own in a lot of ways, versus League of Legends, where you need to be on a franchise team to be able to play professionally. So this conversation about player rights or who should be bargaining against who in esports is impossible because it needs to be game specific. The League of Legends player concerns are very different than the Fortnite player concerns, are very different than the FGC community.
Yeah, I agree with that, man. But another thing is like this is why I think these developer fucking control franchise leagues are just disgusting because what they do is they create a one-stop shop for where you can play your trade. One league, globally, and if you're a troublemaker, you're not in. You don't get invited in. Now, that doesn't really happen with a lot of other mainstream sports. I mean, sure, there's some that kind of by just general geographical interest, but like if the NFL doesn't want you in the NFL, there are other leagues abroad. You could go and be a professional football player. If the Premier League doesn't like what you've done because if you're deemed to be a troublemaker, but you can just go somewhere else. You can play in another league where that reputation won't cling to you. It might be further down the trough. It might not be commensurate to your talents, but you can still make a living off it. Esports doesn't let you do that. Esports, it's like you must toe a line at all times. And those developer franchise leagues are like, they're the worst for that. That's where we need player rights the most. They shouldn't be allowed to exist legally without a player union.
It's so funny. It's such a weird spot that I, as a player rep, am in because totally disagree with you in practice, but I totally agree with you in how it should be. Those franchise leagues have done so much for player rights because Riot and Blizzard set the bar at it. They actually created a minimum barrier to entry. Meanwhile, look at Fortnite or look at Dota, and you still have kids sleeping on the floor. You still have teams that are teams, offering $200 a month in exchange for all of your rights. It's such a hard conversation to have across game. I think Overwatch players should be arguing for Overwatch player rights, and League players should be arguing for League player rights. And this is all fixable. And also the worst attorney answer, the worst middling answer I can give is you're also both right about who should be negotiating against who. The players and teams need to negotiate against each other and get understood about, okay, this is ours, this is yours, how can we all be mutually beneficial? But then, also then together against the publisher, because at the end of the day, publisher is God. They control the IP. You cannot go make your own Overwatch league. They own it. They own the football, and they can take their football home if they don't like you. So it's a really difficult spot for everybody.
The core point there, right, is that, Richard, regardless of whether or not they choose to organize in the form of a franchise league, Valve is the perfect example of this. They organize essentially nothing and can still say to the iBuyPower guys 5 years later, 4 years later, whatever it is, fuck right off, right? Like this is our ecosystem and your persona non grata as far as we're concerned, you're out. So regardless of whether or not there's a franchise league in place, that the problem you're describing exists because someone owns the football. Which is true. But again, think about it in situations where basically what happens is developers sort of give permissions to TOs, just like run a tournament here, run a tournament there. You have to be a vindictive, bitter developer
to sort of be keeping tabs on which players with which teams and who's allowed to play and who isn't. And I almost think your purview is completely fucked. Like, I don't think you really have a remit to say to a player, you know, you can't play for FaZe. If you're Epic Games, you can't play for FaZe because we don't want you entering those tournaments. I absolutely can't do that. It's completely on FaZe's thing. If you're talking about, like, you know, again, we'll just use Washington Justice or whatever as an example. Well, Blizzard actually can say that and do and will.
I think Valve can say it too. Honestly, I mean, we take it for granted because all of this content is per the terms of use of the games. It's licensed, and we let people do basically what they want from the streaming on Twitch or Mixer or whatever, right? But if Valve wants to say this person violated some rule that we have, and every single time someone wants to run an event with our IP, you have to sign a license agreement or agree to this, or license terms of use, right? It doesn't even have to be something you sign. It can just be like Valve video policy exists, right, online. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you agree to when you broadcast is that you'll comply with our rule set, and our rule set includes, hey, you know, there's a banned list of players who have violated some rule, and you can't include them in your event. That's it. Right? It's the terms of your license. If you want to broadcast this, then you can't have these players participating. That's for sure something they could do. It requires no oversight from them, no nothing, because community members will talk about it. It winds up on Reddit or social media, and then Valve's like, hey, you know, tournament organizers violated our clear terms of service by allowing this player to participate, and so we're not going to give you a license anymore. Enjoy not having our business.
I do think that, you know, if you really laid out all the stuff that we're all attorney-client privilege on or NDA'd on or whatever it is, and we were able to just put it to the public and say, here's what the franchise league contract looks like. Here's what every team player contract looks like. Here's all the salaries. Here's all the sponsors spending money in the space, where they're spending it, how they're spending it. And you just gave all the data and information to the public. This would all be fixed overnight. It's very, very obvious who's taking advantage of who, where. And it's very, very obvious who's mistreating who, where. And I think that even the players have no true idea of when I say the money at the top, I mean team, publisher, who the hell knows? But it's all up there. It's not down here yet. And it's starting to I almost said trickle down too, but it's starting to, you know, pierce through here and there, because some of the people up there are skipping everyone else. And they're saying, hey, you know, let's say I'm Coca-Cola. I don't need to go sponsor a team. Don't need to talk to a publisher. Don't need to talk to Twitch. I can go right to the player. And that's going to rock this industry now that the players are becoming more and more aware of what those sponsored dollars look like.
And reaching scale where it's an attractive opportunity, right? Different sponsors viewed differently, right? Some sponsors are obsessed with the notion of turnkey and operating at the league level. Some want a level of organization, but don't want to be at the league level. They want to activate more locally or around a specific property where they can get more content, whatever. Other people want to be direct with talent, and you're going to, until the end of time, as in all entertainment businesses, have different sponsors approaching different parts of the ecosystem based on what their goals are.
Totally.
One area where, because you kind of like opened the door to this, Bryce, where I actually am quite interested is, I feel as though the reason why the battle should happen one day, basically against the game devs, to try and free up some element of the rights to be along the lines of like, well, I as the player should have some sort of right here because, you know, what I created with my performance is really what people are watching, not just the game that you created. The reason why I feel like that should be inevitable is because if you look at the moment, all of those people at the top, as far as I can tell, have an entitlement that, like, it's not just that they have the legal right. They almost feel as though it's correct. Like, the best example would be the way Riot used to address the community, where the reason why there weren't sponsors in the LCS for many years is not because they couldn't get a sponsorship. Like, the idea when they launched, they couldn't have even just gotten a very small one that even is just the brand element to make it look cool. Of course they could. But what they wanted to do was they kept everyone in this world in which they told you all the time, we do this out of the kindness of our hearts. We just like esports. That's why we're because they would always say that line, we lose money doing esports, which I always used to say, imagine if I just rephrased that as, you know, I actually lost money by paying for this advert that I just had put on television. Well, yeah, obviously you make money from selling the product. The advert makes people aware of the product. That was always your monetization system. Well, the point here is they, on the one hand, said like that first part, but they never acknowledged that they actually made money from it. Like, for my games, the best one, Counter-Strike, because if you look at how little additional content there is to Counter-Strike and how little outside of the basic bare bones game exists, except the esports side of let's watch an amazing player play the same game we played for fun for a year when we bought the game. The idea that a game like that would continue for 10 years with no esports, I think is laughable. Like the idea that either doesn't directly stimulate like turnover of players, interest, maintaining a player base. At the very minimum, I think it indirectly does. Like, I'd love to see the stats for, like, what the fucking champions picked in solo queue and what the spike is the second an LCS final ends. And we all know it's the equivalent of the kid running in his backyard and trying to do the shot like Michael Jordan on the hoop or kicking. Of course, everyone knows that happens. Even someone in the industry myself, that fires me up to play the game more when there's the big event. But that is an aspect at the moment, for obvious reasons, that is not acknowledged. They act as though we're kind of just like a cool thing, like they're putting on for fun, like a cool little party for the pros on the side here. And, you know, like we should be very thankful for that. And while we are thankful on some level, it's getting to the point where eventually it's like, why am I the only one thanking you for this, basically?
Yeah. I mean, I have good friends at publishers who stand the party line on that, and it's just a hardcore agree to disagree.
I get it. Again, you don't want it to come out and court that you unofficially said all this stuff, right?
No,
I get it too, but like, I mean, I don't know if there's anyone in the call who's going to disagree with this notion. I am extremely confident that this phenomenon has been studied by every major publisher that continues to invest any money or time in esports, and whether or not they have hard data that shows that esports lead to profitability, or they have enough soft data to convince them that it's worth it to continue to invest tens of millions of dollars a year on this marketing exercise. It is very clear to me that there is some ROI to esports, and it goes back to what we talked about in business at the very beginning of like, there's ancillary benefits to this. It's not always easy to track. Like, it's not always straight up as like, you know, Jensen just won the LCS finals playing this character with this skin, and then we see immediately afterwards a rise of the skin. But there's value to making the game cool, to keeping people engaged in the game, and they spend money on it down the road, right? Like, there is enormous revenue being generated at the publisher level as a result of esports that has nothing to do with how, you know, what sponsors are sold against the LCS.
Yeah. I have a law firm on top of the agency, and the law firm does mostly game dev, not esports. And I mean, the hard data, no data, whatever data, everybody knows esports is leading to profitability, and every developer in the world is trying to figure out how to be an esport right now. Like there's just a button you can flick.
And not in all cases, right?
I guess I should have asked the question. Yeah. Like, the real problem here is I didn't put a question at the end of the premise. Again, the problem there is everyone agreed with the premise. It was actually a conversation killer. Yeah. It was like, right, we all agree this, yeah? Right, that's the end of that. No, I guess the question goes like this then, is how do we access that money? Because it's something, actually, it's a tactic I've even used myself when I'm trying to appeal to the community, because I've found, like, here's one of the problems that we have so in the same way as, like Richard implied, it was disingenuous if you act as though like an org is a mom and pop store, and so, you know, when you think about, oh no, they're losing money, you know, you immediately your heart goes out to them.
Doors or whatever.
Bloody hell! Oh, how is he doing? As you know, in that scenario, the real premise is, well, he's still absolutely making a big salary. Yeah, this will be our topic tonight. But the basic question that goes like this, right? In fuck, you threw me a bit there. Let me think.
Sorry.
It's all right. Wait there a sec. I'll get it back. Oh, here we go. So whenever anyone says in Counter-Strike, for example, like if you ask them something like, why doesn't Valve just make 10 new maps? Why doesn't Valve do this with the circuit? People will always actually default to the equivalent of the mom and pop store thing and be like, but they're just a little company, you know, there's only 8 people there like Counter-Strike, and, you know, they have done quite a lot. Like, they gave us the majors and they gave us those skins and that. And what I always tell people is this: if you look at how much it must have cost to make Counter-Strike, remember, it was actually developed third party, not by Valve. So it was basically shipped out, I would even suggest cynically, because I think they did it just to see, let's cash in on the franchise. And then it just so happened a few years later, they struck gold. They've got the golden goose and they had skins, and it became a massive phenomenon. So if you look at how much it cost to make the game and maintain the game and run the esports side versus the better part of $1 billion they've made revenue from Counter-Strike, they have won so massively, it's unbelievable. So the problem is this: if that alone isn't an incentive to do any of the things you're asking, again, you're going to need leverage before you get any of these things you want. So if we ever want to access any of that billion, they're not just going to give it to us. Like, for start off, like I've said, I implied, I don't think they even think we should have a share. To them, they almost act like it's like the divine right of kings. Like, it's my IP right. I grant who comes to this game. I've even had someone, I won't tell you which developer, outright tell me to my face from a representative that I should never imply they should be grateful I create content for their game because they made the game that I can create the content in, which is, I mean, we'll leave that there. Obviously, it didn't take it well, put it that way, you can imagine. So with the concept we have limited time, what would kind of be the closing statements on this angle then? Because obviously there's no solution, but I just want to know, where does everyone come from? How do we ever get into a world where we could even be at the table to negotiate something like that?
It's not going to be from the consumer because we've proven we're too addicted to this stuff to vote with our wallets. You can see that with the international.
Sure.
You know, I personally...
when people said they were all going to boycott that Call of Duty about 10 years ago and they all just fucking bought it anyway.
Yeah, right. Or you look
that
at
was the best one ever.
I almost went homeless buying levels in the compendium this year. But in all seriousness, I mean, it's going to come down to the more Tifus and more players realizing how much is there and how much they can grab. Or what is interesting is maybe event organizers or whoever it is, I do see a future where IP rights are rocked in the world, where this makes me a crazy attorney. I know I'm very much an outlier amongst my peers with this, but I really do think that technology has shattered copyright, trademark, the understanding of basic IP laws. You know, when does something become a derivative work? What's fair use mean to the average American citizen versus a legal textbook?
Sure.
At some point, that changes legislation or that changes a Supreme Court decision, even slightly, and things can change. Do I think that one day a publisher is going to make a game and it's just open source and everybody's game? No. But do I think that maybe a title can reach a level of success where you're allowed your own iteration or your own version of it? Yeah, I actually do think that's not unreasonable. In trademarks, Xerox lost its trademark because Xerox was too commonly used. You look at things like Kleenex, etc. Velcro made a really hilarious music video about how please stop calling it Velcro or we're going to lose our trademark. When things get too popular in trademark, you lose it. I could see that eventually happening in copyright.
Ryan's also representing the Renegades Dallas arena football team, so
yeah, that's
fluid concept, fluid understanding of IP.
My client came up with that logo. They've never heard of Monty, and I am not representing that. Just before I get the angry
Sure.
So, I mean, look, I look at for historical markers of similar things happening, and from my perspective, like what is the evolution of players gaining leverage in traditional sports, and it's that over time they continued to be good at what they were doing, and because they're an indispensable part of it, the people on the other side of the table had to give up some percentage of share of what they had in order to keep the remainder of what they had, right? Like if you're running the NBA and all the players are walking out on you, it's not really doing you any good. So you have to be willing to find a way to compromise to keep the indispensable piece. I think what we'll see is that teams and players will continue to be an indispensable part of this ecosystem, continue to add enormous value. And over time, as they get bigger and better at what they are doing, right, and become more organized and talk to within each individual group, and then they talk amongst each other, right, that you can leverage what you have built over time in order to demand more, right? Like what the franchise league that's set up today looks like in terms of what the players and teams get as a collective piece of the pie is different than what it will look like in 20 years. And so I think this is something that just naturally over time we gain more leverage and we get better at asserting that leverage.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I kind of feel that we need the transformative argument to come out somewhere along the line. I think there has to be some sort of proof where, it's some sort of court case where what we can do is we can take the game that the developer makes, do something with it, that by putting all the bells and whistles around it, that by hosting a tournament for it, that we don't just have that right of kings from the IP holders. I don't know if anything like that could ever happen, but things like that have happened in various other mediums. It just seems to me right now that being under the tyranny of the developers, we always knew it was going to come. I mean, me and Duncan were talking about this in 2008, 2009. Sure. Now, once the developers realized they could just tell everybody what to do, they very quickly would start doing that. And that's where we're at right now, where they want to control everything. They want to dictate who makes the money. They want to dictate how much rights the players have, who can get rich off their game, who can broadcast their game. It's fair to a point. I understand they've made something. They should be able to have some say over it. But in esports, in the ecosystem, we're getting into these ridiculous positions where they're putting sort of profit over things fundamentally. They want all of the clout of being a sports league without any of the foundations of being a sports league. The franchise leagues that the developers are running are a disgrace to me. I really think there's so much work to be done over there, and I'm a much bigger proponent of kind of the open circuit systems we have in other games. So I don't know, obviously debate for another time, because I know we're on the clock again. But for me, I think somebody's got to challenge kind of like just how much the developer had. We can't operate in an environment where they're judge, jury, and executioner for every little facet as it relates to their game.
And I think it's worth noting that we joked at the beginning that we could have a whole third episode on IP rights, and Duncan just so happened to end us with a question on IP rights. Maybe we'll see you boys again soon.
He's done it soon.
One of those happy accidents.
And I was an IP lawyer for a lot longer than I was an esports lawyer, so I can talk about that.
I like the way it is sort of like mini biography of him. It's like a mini documentary of him as he answers questions in a panel show.
Did you know that he owns an agency and a law firm? Were you aware of that?
Well,
I believe they actually have over 300 players.
More people than anyone else on the planet right now.
More on the planet than anyone. We have no. It just sucks because everyone thinks it's the same company, and the lawyer side of it is not what I do almost ever in esports. I don't have that opportunity. So it's everyone always says, "Why don't you do this, this, and this as an attorney?" It's because I don't rep most of the players as an attorney. It's not an option. But that's why I make the distinction.
This video was kindly supported by stayfungg, Patrick Ribeiro, Alice the Alchemist, Dean Tanglis, Alexander Rao, Blunt Smoking Anus Destroyer, Dane Cuskley, JDubs, Chi Mao, NateDOhDoubleG, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, Who the Fuck is Viathan? Special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in my monthly video AMA. Do you want teasers for my upcoming content, who the guests are going to be? Maybe you even want to take part in an online esports discussion with yours truly. Well, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today. The Patreon link is in the description box below.